Europe, everything is getting more expensive and wages are not keeping up. This means that at the end of the day, most of us have less in our pockets than we had before, and this particularly hits low-wage workers who spend a large portion of their income on daily necessities like food or energy. And the timing for this is really bad, because for years, workers in Europe have had a rough time as their wages stagnated in many EU countries. One of the reasons for this was the rather sluggish economic development over the past decade, which, in turn, was due to a misguided austerity policy that utterly devastated the labour market prospects for a generation of Europeans, but that is not the topic of today's video. Let's just say things were not great for low-wage workers. And after some time, this message also arrived in Brussels. So, in October of 2020, the EU Commission proposed a new directive for adequate minimum wages in Europe. Now, 1.5 years and some negotiations later, the European Parliament and the EU Council, which is where the member state governments meet, agreed on a final text for exactly this directive. So, what does this directive say? Do we now all get to enjoy the same European minimum wage all over the EU? No, the EU does not have the power to decree something like this. Nor would it make much sense, as the economic realities are so different between member states. The directive has basically two main goals: ensuring a decent level for statutory minimum wages and increasing the collective bargaining coverage. First, the directive sets a framework for how statutory minimum wages should be set in each member state that has a statutory minimum wage. Countries like Italy, Denmark, Austria, Cyprus, Finland and Sweden that do not yet have a statutory minimum wage are not forced to introduce one. But the ones that do have a statutory minimum wage should now ensure that it is at least 60% of the member state's median wage, or at least 50% of the average wage in the country. Most EU countries that have a statutory minimum wage are below these thresholds, meaning that we can expect some increases in minimum wages. And according to research from the European Central Bank, this rise in minimum wages is likely to result in somewhat higher wages across the board. However, the EU cannot force the countries to set the minimum wage at 60% of the median wage for every worker in the respective country. Member states still have the possibility to deviate from this guideline and make exceptions. Nevertheless, they need to have a framework in place to regularly revise the minimum wage to see whether it is still adequate. And the 60% threshold defined in the directive provides a good argument for labour unions to push for higher minimum wages. Second, the directive wants to strengthen collective bargaining in the EU. Collective bargaining is when trade unions and business associations negotiate and together determine the working conditions in a certain sector, with the idea to guarantee some level of protection and a decent salary for all employees in this sector. In the past decades, less and less employees have been covered by collective bargaining agreements, thus lowering the level of protection for employees. This is why the Directive for Adequate Minimum Wages also includes the requirement that member states have to make action plans to increase the collective bargaining coverage in their countries if less than 80% of the workforce is covered by collective bargaining agreements. Many EU member states, for example Germany, but also many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, fall below this threshold and will have to draw up action plans to strengthen collective bargaining. If those national action plans actually end up increasing the collective bargaining coverage, this measure should help increase wages across the board, not just for minimum wage workers. This is the Minimum Wage Directive in a nutshell. So, will you see your governments raise minimum wages tomorrow and announce a national plan to support collective bargaining the day after that? Most probably not, because the directive is not quite through the legislative process yet. Although negotiators from the EU Council and the EU Parliament have reached an agreement, the agreement is yet to be officially confirmed by the EU Council and the plenary of the European Parliament. This should be no more than a formality, even though some governments are very skeptical of this directive. The Danish and the Swedish government have long resisted the directive as they have a labour system without much state intervention and even less EU intervention. In Sweden and Denmark, trade unions and business associations negotiate nearly everything on their own, and the rather high wage level seems to indicate that this works well for them, which is why they resist all EU meddling that might pose a risk to their model. Nevertheless, their misgivings will not be enough to stop the directive from passing the Council. And once it has passed, Member State governments have 2 years to implement the directive in their national legislation. Only then, sometime at the end of 2024 or at the beginning of 2025, will the directive be fully in force. Therefore, the directive will not help you cope with the price spike that we are currently experiencing. Only in the medium to long term might it lead to increasing wages.